George helps out. Lots of people were coming to Edward's branch line. Every coach was full to the brim, and Edward was struggling to keep up with it all. The Fat Controller was sympathetic. "I'm afraid the other engines on your line are much too busy with their own work," he told the Blue Engine. "But don't worry, I shall find you help from elsewhere very soon." Edward knew he needed assistance, but he didn't want to cause any fuss. "It's more than all right, sir," he said kindly. "I'm sure I can hold it out for a bit longer." "Are you sure, Edward?" the Fat Controller asked. "Positive, sir," smiled Edward. "I'll try my best." The Fat Controller was concerned, but agreed. And so, Edward kept running his trains without any help. It made him very tired, and the other engines were growing concerned. Unfortunately, it wasn't just the engines who were busy. George was too. The council had plans to revamp the capital town, and had brought the steamroller along. This meant George was a frequent sight close to the railway, and this pleased nobody. It didn't help that the steamroller was even more grumpy than ever, but Edward tried to hold his compassion. "Hello, George," he greeted, as he panted into the station one day. George grunted. "Look at the state of you," he snorted. "It's a bloomin' good thing that they're improving the roads round here. Your passengers must hate riding on your bumpy rails with your bumpy, rotten coaches." Edward didn't reply, and George continued. "You can't handle the weight of a few people. I'll tell you the problem. You're far too old. Your Fat Controller would be better off taking your rails away and whisking you off to a museum." Edward let off steam crossly. "That's quite enough, George," he said sternly. "You have your work to do, and we engines have ours. We don't need to ridicule each other. We're both trying to help the communities, and we're both overloaded." He paused. "And we could both do with a bit of help," he muttered quietly. George scoffed. "The only help I need is less clanking from you, you great big pile of scrap," he retorted. "I'd get on with my work much better without you all bothering me." Just then the guard blew his whistle, and much to Edward's relief, he started away, leaving George to crossly watch him go. The arguments George caused continued for ages. He'd shout rude comments as the engines passed. "He's been a terror," grumbled Boko. "All he does is call us names." "Never mind," comforted Edward. "He'll be gone soon, I'm sure. I think the passenger numbers are starting to go down too. Everything will be much more manageable soon." "For your sake, I certainly hope so," replied Boko worriedly. "You don't look very well at all, Edward." "Would you like me to take your next train? You could go and have a nice rest in the shed." Edward sighed. "You needn't concern yourself, Boko," he told him. "This is the last up train of the day. It'll be no trouble at all." The passengers climbed aboard. The guard blew his whistle and waved his flag, and Edward left the station. Boko watched him go. "Oh dear," he murmured. "I hope he's right." Sadly, Edward wasn't. As he hurried along the line, he began to feel a slight pain. "Something doesn't feel right," he called to his driver. "Can we stop, please?" The driver obliged, and Edward grounded to a halt. "You've broken down, Edward," sighed the fireman. "At least it's not your crank pin this time. You'll have to go and be examined, but right now we'll have to call for another engine." "I'll go run to the last signal box," the driver said. "That one's a long while away," replied the fireman. "You'll be exhausted by the time you get there." Just then they heard a whistle from the road close by. There was George, with his driver, smirking at the train. "Ha!" he chortled. "Run out of puff, have you, Edward? What a joke! Perhaps you will become a museum piece. Railways truly are no good at all." Edward looked sadly at his buffers and remained silent. until... "George," he began, "you'll be going towards the signal box, won't you?" Yes, I suppose," George replied. "Can you take my driver with you, then?" asked Edward. "She needs to get there and call another engine fast." George frowned. "Do I look like a race car?" he scoffed. "No," replied Edward, "but you'd still be faster than her running. Not to mention I'm sure she'd be very grateful for it." George glanced at the train. The passengers looked to be growing impatient, and Edward looked almost desperate. At last he let out a groan. "Fine," he said bluntly. "Oh, thank you, George," beamed Edward, as his driver walked towards the road. "This is very much appreciated." "Uh-huh," scoffed George. "Whatever you say." Edward chuckled softly as he watched George go. A short while later, Boca arrived to pull the train. "Your driver says she got a lift," he remarked. "Yes, indeed," replied Edward. "It's a good thing George was passing through. Otherwise, driver would have gone a cramp. That wouldn't have done at all." A few days later, George was grumpily waiting with the construction workers. "Why are we just sitting around?" he asked. "I thought we had lots of work to do." "We've run out of tar," replied George's driver. "We can't do anything until we get some." Said George. "Unbelievable. They tell me to be part of the hustle and bustle, but now we can't have any bustle." Just then Edward arrived at the station with some trucks. At the front of the train was 2 tar tankers. "Good morning," he called. "We've brought you all some tar. Consider it as us returning the favour for yesterday. George's help proved very useful indeed." George rolled his eyes. Yeah, don't mention it," he replied sarcastically. Edward laughed. "It goes to show," Edward continued, "we all need a bit of help from time to time, and we can give that help too. Surely we can agree on that, right, George? Are all of you Fat Controller's engines this sappy?" That's one way of putting it." "I sincerely hope our next project is as far away from your railway as possible." That figures,"